Suicide is the second leading cause of death for people ages 10 to 34. 90% of those who die by suicide have experienced symptoms of a mental health condition. 75% of those who die by suicide are male. And the rate of suicide has increased 31% since 2001. Depression and anxiety disorders cost the global economy $1 trillion in lost productivity. And I would imagine everyone has been impacted by a personal connection to mental illness or suicide, Amy.
Yeah. And Holland, this is kind of hard to hear these stats on suicide and mental illness. Mm-hmm. And behind each of these facts is a person, a family, a community that shares a story. And, there's even a movement right now from the Depression and Bipolar Support Alliance, which encourages wellness and education for those whose lives have been affected by mood disorders. And they use some hashtags like hashtag I'm here, hashtag you are never alone, and hashtag I'm living proof to promote conversations and awareness.
Yeah, one organization posted to Instagram, they said, if suicide ever crosses your mind, just know that I'd rather listen to your situation than listen to your eulogy.
Yep.
The subject of mental illness and suicide, though, often I think creates this fear and conflict and shame. So how do we flip that narrative and bring a dark subject into the light? We have two guests at the table tonight who will share from their own experiences that hope and recovery are possible.
Hi, I'm Holland Webb.
Hi, I'm Amy Boland.
And you're listening to The Afterword, a conversation about the future of words.
Dr. Kathryn Greene-McCreight is a priest affiliate at Christ Church New Haven, where she serves as spiritual director with St. Hilda's House. Most recent books include Darkness is My Only Companion, A Christian Response to Mental Illness, and I Am With You, the Archbishop of Canterbury's Lent book. So welcome, Kathryn, and please share with us how you're doing and what you're doing currently.
Thank you. It's great to be here. It's a privilege. I'm doing very well. And what I'm doing now is I do some work at church. Actually, right now, I don't do any work at church because I'm sitting here at home doing a lot of Zoom meetings. I do some spiritual direction with some of the St. Hilda's interns, which I can explain something about that, but that's probably not the most important subject for us to get to tonight. And I'm working on a few books. One is on forgiveness, and that's with a series, the name of which I'm forgetting, a very good series. Here's one of the ones, 10 Commandments by Peter Leithart, and the series is by Lexham Press. I don't know if you all know of that, but it's a fairly new press. Anyway, so they've assigned to me forgiveness, and it's a very large topic, but they want a very short book. So that's a challenge. And then I'm working on a commentary on Galatians, and I hope also to get to a sort of a second edition to my Darkness book. And that will be light. The Lord is my light and my salvation.
I love that. That's wonderful. Well, thank you for giving us that insight. And Kathryn, we will put all of your information on our landing page so that people can get a hold of Ms. Kathryn Greene-McCreight and where her books are and be able to connect with you.
Great.
But our other guest tonight is Terry Lee. She is the founder and director of Overflow Foundation, which desires to pour hope into life by promoting mental health awareness and suicide prevention, as well as providing mental health education. She's married to Philip, the mother of 5 children, and I got to see Philip real quick before we started the podcast and wave through Zoom. That was exciting. And so tell us a little bit about what's going on right now, Terry.
Sure. Thank you so much. So again, I'm a nurse, 5 children, all adult children right now. So we pretty much have empty nest syndrome, and a pastor's wife. And so I'm working primarily in mental health now, again, trying to promote mental health and suicide prevention, as well as provide mental health education to healthcare professionals as well as the general public. And so right now, just as a pastor's wife, we're in the middle of all of this coronavirus, just like everyone else. And so my work alongside Philip is just to continue to try to pour hope into the lives of people who are feeling the effects of all of this financially, vocationally, being, quarantined at home with their regular routines kind of being abruptly changed. And so I do anything from bake muffins to deliver them in our neighborhood to elderly folks to delivering supplies and goodies for the staff at the hospital who are working in overdrive right now. So just trying to keep really everybody encouraged and moving forward and future thinking as well, because, we, as difficult as this is, we will get through it, I believe. And there'll be something else for us after this coronavirus is over, hopefully. And so just trying to keep everybody positive.
I really appreciate that. And for our regular listeners, if you're hearing some different sounds for tonight's episode, it's because we are all recording remotely on Zoom. And so this is new technology for the Afterword podcast. And we're so grateful that this technology has given us some provision to be able to do this tonight and not interrupt the Afterword podcast. And so we're very grateful. And, when Holland and I planned out our calendar for guests, we had no idea that coronavirus and all these things were coming at us. We kind of believe that this is providential and that there's a reason for this episode to be happening at this time. So, Kathryn and Terry, thank you so much for joining us at the table tonight.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
All right.
Yes.
So, Kathryn, I'm going to start off with you. How do we balance belief in God with personal struggles like mental illness? And I know that's a loaded question, kind of like you've been tasked to write a very short book on forgiveness. So I'm kind of hitting you right between the eyes with a heavy question. But
Well, actually, it's pretty easy because what you're saying is you're asking me how I balance belief in God with personal struggles, but that doesn't, we don't balance belief in God with anything else. I mean, belief in God is it, right? For the Christian.
absolutely.
So it's how do I bring personal struggles like my own mental illness before God, at the feet of God? How do I do that? So it's not a matter of balance. And that's not only a matter of my quibbling with words, it's also understanding where we are as Christians who suffer. We're not on our own. We're not balancing anything like a mother might juggle a lot of balls when she's trying to be a person who works outside the home and has these children. It's not like that. But it's knowing that our life before God, that's what is objective. The personal struggles are all there, and they always are going to be there, depending on, we all have struggles of any type, but the objective part is God.
I love that. And I do appreciate the quibbling with words because it's a tough subject. And, sometimes the questions haven't been asked the right way. And when we're suffering, we may not ask the question the right way. And you flip the question on its head a bit. And I think that put it in perspective. And I appreciate that. What about you, Terry?
Yeah, I loved her answer. That just really makes me think about it in a whole different way. I guess as simplistic as my thought processes are, though, I guess everything begins and ends with God. And I guess that's similar to what Kathryn said. And just thinking about the situation that our family has been through the last year and a half. We lost our son to suicide after a fairly new mental diagnosis of bipolar disorder. And he was also struggling with a substance use disorder as well. And so were it not for the presence of God in my life, I know that I would not have endured the journey that we have been on. And it continues to be extremely difficult. But God, I guess, is what I would say to that. And so that is what sustains me one day at a time, because the grief and the pain are still very, very apparent and real for our family.
I don't know how you do it. I don't know how you face the day. I mean, I didn't realize that about you until you said that. I've had a lot of friends and 2 cousins and a lot of people that I know who've ended their own lives, but I just don't know how I would handle it as a mother. So I totally respect you, that you are still a follower of Christ, that you're still a Christian, that you are still struggling with how to deal with that pain. I respect you hugely.
I appreciate that greatly. It's just a one day, sometimes a one moment at the time journey. I am just now beginning to see on some days the light of day. I will say that kind of because it has been the greatest pain and difficulty of my life. I mean, I lost my parents when I was 17 in a car accident. And so I have known grief, but nothing equates the grief of the loss of a child, at least for me personally. It has been a completely different kind of grief. And then to lose a child to suicide, and there are so many tangents of that too, based on who and Philip and I are, because pastor and pastor's wife, we're kind of in the hope business, so to speak. Of course, I use that very loosely, but trying to keep everybody focused on where ultimately our hope comes from. And so then to have this in our very own home was devastating, to say the least. And then it hit me even harder as a nurse, because I thought, oh my goodness, what signs and symptoms did I miss? How could I have not realized some of the things that were going on with our son? And he was 29. He was not in our home. And I knew as a nurse I was seeing the signs and symptoms of substance abuse, but never in a million years, Kathryn, realized that we were also dealing with a mental health or mental illness component until we got that diagnosis. And so that all of that has been part of my grief counseling now. My husband, several of our children, myself included, we're still in counseling. I probably will be in counseling the rest of my life, just because it helps to talk. It's talk therapy. And it helps for me to talk about it.
Well, thank you so much for sharing, Terry, and appreciate your wisdom.
Would you mind sharing more of your own story, Terry?
Sure. Well, I grew up in a small town in South Carolina, a large family. We grew up with 5 children. My husband grew up in a family of 5 children too. So I tease him all the time and say I should have run from him when we realized that we both came from families of 5 children. And now we both have 5 children. But as I said, my parents died when I was 17. They were in a car accident. And so that was probably my first, I had asked Jesus to come into my heart. And so I was a Christian at that point, but not really understanding what all of that meant at the time. But when I lost my parents, I understood a little bit more fully what that meant in realizing that, oh my goodness, there's something greater than me in this that's going to have to sustain and help me through this difficult time. So that's really where my journey as a Christ follower began. And God used that situation to make me a different person, to make me, I believe, a different mother than I would have been had I not lost my parents. And so family became of paramount importance to me. My children and my husband are just the light of my life. But I have also realized through the loss of my son that maybe I had family a notch or 2 above God, and that I needed to make sure that I kept things in the right priority there as well. And I realized that regardless of what I tried to do to keep my children safe, which was my ultimate goal as a mother after having lost my parents, that God was in control, and that this mother could not keep the universe revolving and keep everything going for my children. And so I had to step back and realize that God had his hand on the lives of my children and wanted to use their life as he saw fit. And I believe that God has used my son Philip's life, and he is using his death in a very evident way right now through the work that Overflow Foundation is doing. It is a difficult, painful journey, but it gets me out of bed in the morning. There's some days that I choose to still recluse and stay home, that I do my own self-care and make sure I'm taking care of myself. But to try to reach out to others now and provide some mental health education that even I, as a nurse of 35 years, did not have, I believe is pivotal to be getting a message out there and be trying to reduce the stigma surrounding mental health, because I believe that's one of the reasons that our son did not reach out for help.
Wow. It's interesting how what we do for others, the most meaningful things that we do for others, seem almost inevitably to grow out of our deepest pain and our own deepest sense of loss is what we want. We want to give to others what we lost ourselves.
Right. I would agree with that.
Wow. Kathryn, what about you? What's your personal interest in mental health?
Well, yes. So my own interest is not anything but existential. It's what sort of God put at me. When I was in the postpartum period of after our daughter was born, I started experiencing some symptoms that I did not understand. And a friend did, and he said I really needed to get to the health care at Yale. We were both graduate students. From then on in, it's been a journey. I mean, so postpartum depression, maybe 4 years later, I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. Then I've had a lifetime of treatments, medical, psychotherapeutic, non-medical, and what they call interventional psychiatry, hospitalizations, many hospitalizations, and an incredibly supportive husband. I wouldn't be here talking to you if it weren't for him and how God has used him in my life. Just a huge blessing. So what else can I tell you?
I think that covers it. I think we understand who you are.
Okay.
And the background you speak out of. I think this is one of those issues in which you can be an academic expert, but that only goes so far, right? If your expertise is not deeply rooted in your own lived experience, then it's hard for people to believe that you really know what you're talking about.
Well, see, the thing is, I'm not an academician in this subject matter. My ex-field is theology, Christian theology, and interpretation of the Bible. And I'm a priest in the Episcopal Church, and I have had all sorts of wonderful experiences in ministry. The only reason that takes me in here is my own experience of mental illness. But I also have had, throughout my life, starting when I was about 12, just a series of friends and relatives and parents of friends and neighbors and all sorts of different relationships to me who've taken their own lives, which is why when I imagine Terry's journey, I just, and I wasn't the mother of any of these people, but the pain is just horrible. I don't think there's any pain. I don't think people can even realize how much the family suffers when a family member takes his or her own life. The reason we don't know how awful it is for the very thing Terry just said, is the stigma. The family doesn't want you to know how awful it is. No one wants you to know because it's shameful and everyone wants to turn their face away.
You know, Kathryn, that really leads us into our next question, because both of you have kind of hit it, but I'd like to kind of put a period or a punctuation mark at the end of this thought. And so, Kathryn, have you experienced a more open dialogue around the topic of mental illness and suicide in our communities? And then how has that supported individuals and families?
Well, yeah. I mean, I first wrote that book. Well, the first edition was published in 2006, and the second edition in 2015. But I started writing it, must have been 2003, 2004. So looking back to that point, things have changed so much since then. The stigma really has chipped away. But I got to say, at the same time, a friend of mine who was one of the key psychiatrists at Yale was trying to tell me how really there was no stigma anymore. Things had come so far, there really isn't any stigma. It's so much better. And I thought, wait, she's a psychiatrist and she's telling me there's no more stigma? Well, that's because she's a psychiatrist and not either a patient or a family member. So there's still a lot of stigma, even though it's much better than it was. And yes, I think all of this opening of the dialogue and the sort of just hearing people's voices, breaking open that tomb, and that has, supported individuals and families very much so. I'm involved with a national organization called NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Illness. I'm on the board of one of the local affiliates, and that works so our three objectives are education, support, and advocacy. Mm-hmm. So, and you probably all know about that, but it's just to say those are very important goals, and all of them work to that single goal of chipping away at the stigma. And opening up that space for conversation is what heals.
Well, I really appreciate that. And I would agree. I'm not sure stigma can be said that we've eradicated it, but certainly maybe opened up that space for conversation. What about you, Terry? Because I know that's one of your tenets as well with Overflow.
Right. So I guess I approach it from the vantage point of a mother and a nurse. With Philip, Philip was extremely popular in high school. He was the quarterback of the football team, pitcher on the baseball team, was an academic scholarship to college as well as athletic scholarship. And then he was kind of the total package in that he was also very creative and musical. He was a professional singer-songwriter and had signed a music promotion deal with a music promoter out in California. And so he was very much kind of on a pedestal because of his notoriety, especially in the Southeast. And part of that, I think, is part of what made it difficult for him to hold up his hand and kind of wave the white flag and say, I'm struggling. He did admit eventually that he had an alcohol issue and got psychiatric evaluation as he was going into rehab for the substance abuse. But still, we certainly saw the stigma as part of his difficulty in, I think, admitting that something's going on, because he finally told us, and we read in his journal, he went for really 2.5 years living kind of somewhat of a secret life and trying to drink enough alcohol to put himself to sleep every night. And we know that now that was the bipolar disorder. But then even still in the medical community and in the nursing community, you would be amazed at the number of physicians who have difficulty talking with their patients about the mental health aspect of their wellness. These are primary care physicians who are not real sure about how to ask their patients that question, are you having thoughts of suicide? And so I've been really in the middle of that as a nurse, trying to educate them and trying to make them more comfortable with the topic and say, if you're not assessing your patient's mental health as well as their physical health, then you're not getting the whole picture of the wellness of your patient. And so even breaking that stigma within the healthcare community, I would have to say, I absolutely agree with Kathryn. We are still punching our fist through the wall of stigma. We are not there yet. We still have a lot of work to do to get people comfortable with talking about mental illness as well as physical illness and health, both sides of that spectrum.
Wow. And you have so much expertise to be able to address that with the medical community. And Kathryn, I would imagine you have some inroads with the church community. And so having both of you coming at this topic in two different spheres is such an important thing. And let me just clarify, when you say Philip, you're talking about Philip Jr., not your husband.
That's correct.
Okay, because our listeners maybe have picked up that there's two Philips. So I want to make sure that everybody understood that.
As we think about stigma, what creates stigma or what maybe helps eradicate it, think about books and movies and how people with mental illnesses are portrayed in books and movies. Do you think that overall stories and the stories that we consume are helping bring an accurate picture of people with mental illness and helping readers and viewers to understand people and empathize a little more? Or do you think they're further creating stigma? Kathryn, what would you say?
I'm hard-pressed to think of any movie that accurately portrays anybody suffering from a mental illness. I think all of the ones I can think of are just horrible at reinscribing that stigma. But maybe Terry has a better sense.
No, I would agree. I mean, I think Hollywood has definitely portrayed it in a negative light. You know, you think of Frankenstein and Split and all of these movies that portray it in a negative light. And so that's one of the things actually that Overflow Foundation is trying to combat as well, and that me as a mom is trying to combat, because Philip was so popular in this area and had so many followers on Facebook, et cetera, et cetera. I'm trying to utilize social media in a way that can help people understand a little bit more about mental health. And so I use Mondays, Philip Jr., I'll say that, Amy, so that I'm not confusing the listeners. Philip Jr. used to post some of his music, some of his original music on Monday mornings, and he would call it Music Monday. And so after his death, and after I had gotten at least far enough along in my grief that I could have a conversation with folks about mental illness and all of this, and felt like I was making sense to some extent, I began to post his music on Monday mornings, but called it Music Monday with a mental health moment. And so would share something, some piece of mental health education, usually from the National Council on Behavioral Health, from their mental health first aid curriculum, so that it's very basic information, but it's getting information out there to the general public so that they can maybe have an aha moment with, oh my goodness, I didn't know that, or I didn't realize this about mental illness. And then I also play his videos and put his face back there so that they can equate someone as beautiful and talented as our son was with someone who also lived with mental illness. And so the message that I'm so desperately trying to get out there for folks is that you can live, and Kathryn, you're a wonderful, glowing example of this as well. You can live well and live with a mental illness. I'm not saying it's easy. It's a struggle and is as painful as many of those physical illnesses out there. I think mental illness in many ways is one of the greatest struggles that my husband and I have ever witnessed individuals going through, because what do we use to help deal with even our physical illnesses and health? We use our mind, right? And so our mind, when we're dealing with mental disorders, we're having challenges from the very start. And so just trying to portray, using social media again, to portray that beautiful, talented folks are the folks with mental disorders and to put it in a positive, healthy light, that you can live and survive with a mental illness, and you can thrive with it. Again, not easy, difficult journey sometimes, but you can thrive with it.
I appreciate that. You said beautiful, and it did make me think about the movie Beautiful Mind. And that, again, may not be a great example of a movie, but I appreciate the positive spin that, like you said, there can be hope. And I really appreciate the idea of putting a real face to this conversation. I think that's just very courageous of you. And Kathryn, with all of your books and getting ready to do a re-release, again, just huge admiration for what your work. All right. So what is an essential element we need to consider as we explore mental illness and suicide? Kathryn, I'm going to throw that to you first.
Well, one of the things I thought of when Terry was speaking is when she was talking about, you can live with this, you can live with a mental illness, which is true. One way I like to think about it is that I myself live with a mental illness, but I'm not always ill. So sometimes I'm symptomatic and sometimes I'm not. And it's kind of like having diabetes where you have to sometimes be taking your medicine every day, or like asthma where you always have to have your asthma inhaler around. That's my analogy. I find is more apt. But one of the things about mental illnesses is that because they are episodic, in other words, they come and they go, if someone is suicidal, the most important thing is first to get them to a safe place, physically safe place, and then to remind them that they just have to hang on. They just have to hang on, because if they can hang on, they'll be able to get through it. But sometimes it's just the hanging on. Sometimes it's just the hanging on. But I think that's the important thing for me, is to remember that I have this illness, but I'm not always ill. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yes.
Perfect sense. I suffer from cold-induced asthma. I do not have asthma all the time. When I have a cold, I typically have, that experience of an elephant on my chest and I can't breathe, but I don't have it all the time. And when you have just shared this as just like this huge aha moment, you live with it, but it is episodic. And I think for me, even mentally, even thinking about this whole coronavirus thing, this is an episode in life. We all have to hang on. I mean, there's similar things that we have to do right now. Wow, that was brilliant. Thank you for sharing that, Kathryn.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for thinking I was brilliant.
How about you, Terry?
Yeah, I guess I think about Philip Jr. in this. So I go back to the personal situation that we've been through with him, and thinking about some of the things that my counselor has said to me in my grief over this, because naturally as a mom, I would want to say, the coulda, shoulda, wouldas. What did we not see? What did we not do that we should have done? All of that. And something that another pastor's wife said to me very shortly after the loss of Philip was that she reminded Philip Sr., my husband and I, she asked us to remember that we had done all that we could do when we knew to do it. And I think if I can force myself to look back at the situation, I think that is true. And one of the things that the counselor also said to remember is that when someone dies by suicide, when we think about what is our most basic instinct is survival, right? And so when someone dies from suicide, it is really something that when I just try to think of it in the most basic way, it's like I cannot understand how Philip could have been in that room and willingly chose to do what he did. But what the counselor has told me and has helped me understand is that Philip was not in his right mind, so to speak, when he died by suicide, and that Philip was not turning loose of us or family or loved ones or those maybe protective factors that were there for him. Philip was turning loose of the pain and that he was feeling, the mental and emotional pain that he was feeling at the time. And so I think what we really need to remind ourselves of, and I won't even use the word understand, because I don't think any of us, unless we have had suicidal thoughts or have dealt with a mental disorder that causes thoughts like this, can understand what they're going through. The amount of emotional and mental pain that someone is going through at that time is, I believe, in that moment, absolutely insurmountable. And so I believe that they are trying to turn loose and get away from the most excruciating pain that they have ever experienced. And so as a mom, that hurts my heart, to know that, to feel like that's potentially where Philip was. But in hearing that from my counselor, it has also helped me glean just a little bit of where he was in that moment. And somehow that's helped me a little bit to know that he was in that, not helped me to know that he was in that much pain. Do you understand what I'm saying? That it's helped explain it a little bit for me,
Sure.
I think.
Yeah. Yeah, that does make sense. And, again, human beings are problem solvers. We're trying to come up with some sort of solution to the pain. So having something that we can put a hook on
Right.
in those times is helpful. And so, those are some wise words. And again, doing the best that you could in that moment and resting in that peace of knowing that. Wow. Thank you so much for sharing. Kathryn, could you share how people can get a hold of your books?
They can go to Amazon.
Where everybody else is going right now.
That's right. Right. Well, the book actually, it's not at all academic. It's just basically my own attempt to try to understand how God was working in my illness. Just that Terry talks about the pain and just the hanging on, the trying to hang on, and just how can I hang on? And why are you doing this to me? And all of that. So I think you're exactly right, Terry. Your son was not rejecting you by any stretch of the imagination. He was rejecting his pain. That's how I see it. It's just so painful to be in that situation. And I do think you're right also, Terry, that I think it's near to impossible for anyone else to understand it. Like, how could you understand wanting to do that to yourself? I myself never wanted to do that to myself, but I was at points where I did not want to live. I didn't want to kill myself, but I didn't want to live. That doesn't make any sense. I know.
Yes, it does. Yeah, that can totally understand those words. Yeah. So Terry, where can people hear about Overflow Foundation?
Sure. We have a website. It's simply overflow.foundation. It gives you a little bit more about the story. You can see some of Philip's music videos there. You can download his music also if you would like to. It also has some helpful resources under one of the tabs for people if they need nationwide resources regarding mental health or substance use disorders. And it also has a place where you can sign up to take a mental health first aid course, which is what I teach. And I will travel. I can teach up to 30 in a class. National Council for Behavioral Health caps the class at that because it's a very interactive class. But it is an excellent class to teach just the signs and symptoms of someone who may be in crisis or who may be developing a mental disorder so that you know how to assist them, the things to do and the things to say to take care of them in the moment or to get them to their next level of care.
Mm-hmm.
And
Right.
so I can't speak highly enough for the content of that course. And so you can look at overflow.foundation and see any of that information there.
So it's overflow.foundation?
That's correct.
And we will link all of that in our show notes as well. So we will have all of Kathryn's information and Terry's information. And ladies, I just want to thank you for joining us at the table tonight. This is going to conclude part 1 of our conversation about the impact of mental illness and suicide in our culture. And so, again, we will link all this information. We know this is a heavy topic, but we do think it's such a timely piece of information that we want to get out to our listeners and to those who might be suffering in this way. And we are so appreciative of Dr. Kathryn Greene-McCreight and Terry Lee as they inspire us with their stories of hope. And that's what I want everyone to hear too, is they have stories of hope with dealing with topics of suicide and mental illness. And so as you wait for part 2 of this conversation, please make sure you leave us a review, rate us on iTunes, and become a subscriber to the Afterword podcast. It does help keep the conversations like this going. And as always, please remember that you are welcome at our table.